Have you ever wondered what happens when justice fails and a man takes it into his own hands? For years, Officer Gregory Callaway and Officer Anthony Miller did whatever they wanted. Every traffic stop was a trap, every complaint disappeared. They ruled through fear, knowing no one could touch them, until they harassed the wrong man. A black man walking his German Shepherd through a quiet neighborhood, a man they assumed was powerless, just another face they could intimidate. When he didn't submit, when he questioned their authority, they escalated. Harsh words became threats, threats became violence, and when his dog stepped forward, one of them reached for his gun. Now Malcolm Hayes, a Delta Force operative with nothing left to lose, is coming for them. The officers thought they understood power, thought their badges made them untouchable, but they have no idea what's coming. Justice will be swift and painful. Could one man really bring down a corrupt system? Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe to Dark Threads. The afternoon sun cast long shadows over the quiet suburban street, its golden light filtering through the trees that lined the neatly paved sidewalks. Rex's paws tapped rhythmically against the concrete, his ears flicking at the distant hum of a lawn mower, the occasional chirp of birds hidden among the branches. His leash hung loosely in Malcolm's grip, the German Shepherd moving in perfect sync with his owner, alert but relaxed. It was a beautiful day, one of those rare moments when the world felt still, uncomplicated. Malcolm took a slow breath, inhaling the crisp scent of freshly cut grass, feeling the weight of the day ease just slightly. This walk was part of his routine, a simple pleasure after long weeks spent traveling for work. He had been away longer than usual this time, overseeing security operations overseas. Now that he was back, he wanted nothing more than to enjoy the little things, a quiet walk with Rex, the feeling of the sun on his skin, the comfort of home. Yet, even as he savored the moment, he was aware of the eyes. It always happened, a car rolling to a slow stop at a nearby intersection, the slight movement of a curtain in a second-story window, a jogger who hesitated just a little too long before continuing past. Malcolm had spent most of his adult life in high-risk environments where survival depended on reading a situation before it unfolded. Out there, it was about identifying threats, enemy combatants, hidden explosives, unseen dangers waiting in the shadows. Here, in the place that was supposed to be home, it was different, subtler, less overt, but no less real. He felt it in the way strangers' eyes lingered on him just a second too long, in the way some clutched their purses a little tighter, in the way a man walking his golden retriever had crossed the street last week without ever making eye contact. He had done nothing but exist, and still, it was enough to make people uneasy. It was ironic, really. He had spent over a decade in the most elite counter-terrorism unit in the world, the U.S. Army's Delta Force. He had operated in places where stepping into the wrong alley meant never stepping out again, where trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. He had taken down warlords, dismantled terrorist cells, protected people who never even knew they were in danger, and yet, here in his own neighborhood, the place he had paid for with blood, sweat, and sacrifice, he was the one who didn't belong. A car turned the corner ahead, creeping forward at a pace that felt too deliberate. Malcolm glanced toward it, already knowing what he was about to see, the black and white job, the familiar shape of the police cruiser. The low, humming growl in Rex's chest was so soft that no one else would have heard it. Malcolm gave the leash a small tug. Easy, boy, his voice calm, soothing. Rex obeyed instantly, his head tilting toward Malcolm as if reading his expression. The cruiser slowed as it pulled alongside him, matching his pace. Then came the voice, "Afternoon, sir." Malcolm stopped walking, turning toward the vehicle with measured ease. His posture was relaxed, his expression neutral, no tension, no challenge. "Afternoon, officer," he replied, keeping his tone polite, always polite. The driver, Officer Callaway, leaned against the open window, his expression unreadable but his eyes assessing, cataloging, searching. His partner, Officer Miller, had already stepped out of the vehicle, his boots crunching against the pavement as he positioned himself just a few steps away, close enough to intimidate, far enough to claim it wasn't intentional. They weren't here for a friendly chat. "You live around here?" Callaway asked, tilting his head slightly, his voice casual, too casual. "Yes, sir," Malcolm answered without hesitation. Callaway's lips twitched, like he wasn't expecting the automatic respect. "That's so funny, don't think I've seen you before." Malcolm offered a small, polite nod. "I travel a lot for work, security contracting overseas, just got back a few days ago." Miller scoffed under his breath, shaking his head. Security contracting, that's some kind of fancy way of saying mercenary. Malcolm let out a soft chuckle, as though he wasn't the least bit offended. Let them think they had the upper hand. Not quite, he said, keeping his voice friendly. Private security for high-risk environments. I consult for agencies and corporations, help train teams for emergency response. Callaway nodded slowly, but there was something in his expression that didn't sit right. Well, he said, shifting slightly, we got a call about someone looking suspicious in the neighborhood, figured we'd check it out. Malcolm raised a brow but kept his tone even. I see, I wasn't aware walking my dog was suspicious. Callaway smirked. You'd be surprised what people think is suspicious these days. Miller took a slow step closer, his eyes dropping to Rex, who was still standing calmly but watching the officers with quiet intensity. That's a big dog, Miller commented, feigning interest. Trained, yes sir. Trained for what? Malcolm let the question settle in the air for a moment, still maintaining his relaxed stance. He knew where this was going. Obedience, protection, he's very disciplined. Miller nodded slowly, as if weighing the words, then Callaway shifted the conversation. Going to need to see some ID. It wasn't a request. Malcolm knew his rights. He could ask why, he could refuse, he could stand his ground, but he also knew exactly what kind of men he was dealing with. Of course, he said smoothly, already reaching into his jacket, moving slowly, deliberately. Rex let out a barely audible rumble, shifting slightly closer. Callaway's eyes flicked toward the dog, and Malcolm didn't miss the way his fingers twitched near his belt. Whoa there, Miller muttered, his voice just a little sharper. You might want to keep that thing under control. Malcolm's jaw tightened just slightly, but his voice remained level. Rex is fine, he's well trained. Callaway chuckled under his breath. Yeah, we'll see about that. Something about the way he said it made Malcolm's stomach tighten. It was the tone, the unspoken promise of what was coming next. He pulled his wallet out carefully, holding it up. Callaway barely glanced at it before waving his hand dismissively. Nah, I think we're going to need you to step over here for a second, just a few questions. Malcolm exhaled slowly, carefully. Don't give them an excuse. He gave Rex's leash the lightest tug, signaling the command to stand down, then he stepped forward, and that was when everything changed. Malcolm stepped forward, moving with deliberate calm, his wallet held out for them to take. Rex's leash remained steady in his grip, his stance unchanged, but the dog's body had tensed just slightly, an imperceptible shift that only Malcolm would have noticed. He could feel the weight of the officer's scrutiny, the way their eyes tracked his every movement, how Callaway's smirk barely masked the sharp edge of control he was trying to exert over the situation. Miller took the wallet with a lazy sort of arrogance, flipping it open like he expected to find something damning inside. His fingers traced over the identification card, his lips twisting slightly before he turned it toward Callaway. Well, look at that, Miller mused, shaking his head. We got ourselves a real-life soldier. Callaway took the wallet from him, glancing at it with an unimpressed expression. Delta Force, huh? His voice carried that same casual disdain, as if even Malcolm's service to the country wasn't enough to earn a shred of basic respect. That's supposed to mean something? Malcolm didn't react. He had learned long ago that men like this wanted a reaction, craved it, fed off it. Any sign of irritation or defiance would only give them an excuse to push harder, so he remained as he was, calm, polite, immovable. It means I've served, he said, his tone even, measured. And now I work in security consulting, as I mentioned earlier. Callaway let out a small chuckle, shaking his head before handing the wallet back to Malcolm in a way that forced him to step closer to take it. It was a small thing, but Malcolm recognized it for what it was, a power play. He took his wallet back, tucking it into his jacket without breaking eye contact. That's so, Callaway drawled, because what I see is a guy walking around a neighborhood where people don't seem to recognize him, and you know how it is, folks around here get nervous when they see someone they don't think belongs there. It was clear they weren't even bothering with subtlety anymore. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. I do belong, I live here. Yeah? Callaway folded his arms, stepping just slightly closer. Then you won't mind answering a few more questions, would you? Malcolm remained where he was, neither retreating nor advancing. I believe I already have. Miller scoffed under his breath, adjusting his belt. I don't know, Callaway, something about his attitude don't sit right with me. Guy seems a little tense, don't you think? Callaway smirked, yeah, almost like he's got something to hide. Malcolm took in a slow breath, centering himself, resisting the natural urge to respond. He had been in more hostile situations than he could count, had faced warlords, insurgents, men with bombs strapped to their chests, enemies who wanted him dead, and had every means to make it happen. Yet, in all those years, he had never felt quite this level of restraint tightening around him like a vice, because here, in his own country, in the very place he had fought to protect, he wasn't seen as a man who had served. As a citizen with rights, he was a threat, a problem to be handled. And Rex knew it. The dog had been trained to read situations, to recognize tension, to detect when his handler was in danger, and right now, though Malcolm remained still, Rex could sense that something was wrong. His ears were up, his gaze locked on the officers, his body language shifting from relaxed to alert. Callaway noticed. "You got that thing under control?" he asked, motioning toward Rex with a tilt of his chin. Malcolm tightened his grip just slightly on the leash. "He's fine, he's trained." Miller narrowed his eyes. "Yeah, trained for what?" Malcolm kept his expression neutral. "Protection, security, he follows commands." Callaway let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "A dog like that, all trained up to attack, dangerous thing to be walking around with, don't you think?" "He's not trained to attack," Malcolm corrected, his patience thinning despite himself. "He's trained to defend." "Yeah?" Callaway's smirk widened. "And what exactly does he think you need defending from, huh?" The words sat between them, heavy with meaning. Malcolm said nothing. Miller exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "I don't know, Callaway, guy's got a big dog, won't answer questions, seems real on edge." He took another step forward, this time intentionally closing the space between them. "I think maybe we need to go ahead and bring him in, just to be safe." Malcolm could feel Rex's tension spiking, the leash pulling just slightly as the German Shepherd adjusted his stance, muscles coiled, prepared. He could sense what was happening, could feel the shift, the moment just before a situation spiraled out of control. "You don't need to do that," Malcolm said, his voice carefully measured. "I've cooperated, I've shown my ID, there's no cause to detain me." Miller gave an exaggerated shrug. "Maybe, but see, I just don't like the way this is going, and I think we need to make sure everything checks out." Callaway tilted his head. "I think we're going to need you to turn around, put your hands behind your back, just for our safety, you understand?" Malcolm's jaw clenched ever so slightly, but his voice remained calm. "I haven't done anything." "Yeah?" Callaway smiled, stepping closer. "Then you won't mind." It was a test, a deliberate, calculated provocation, and then Miller reached out, a hand on Malcolm's wrist, firm, insistent. Rex's snarl cut through the air like a blade. Instantly, both officers' hands went to their weapons. Malcolm moved without thinking, a shift of his arm, a fluid motion redirecting Miller's grip without force, stepping back even as he held Rex's leash firm, grounding the dog before he could move. "Whoa, whoa, whoa," Malcolm said quickly, his voice calm but sharp with authority. "He's reacting to your aggression, stand down." But they weren't listening. Miller had already drawn his gun, his face twisted into something Malcolm had seen before, fear disguised as control. "Get that dog back!" Callaway barked, stepping away, his own hand hovering over his holster. Rex was still in place, but his entire body was taut, his instincts screaming, his eyes locked on the men who now posed a clear and present danger to his handler. Malcolm's pulse slowed, his training kicking in, every single variable flashing through his mind in an instant. This wasn't going to end well. Malcolm raised his hands slowly, palms facing outward, his voice even, firm, controlled. "Listen, officers, I live here, you saw my ID, my address is on it, there's no issue." Rex remained still, but Malcolm could feel the leash tightening in his grip, his dog sensing every inch of his unease, every shift in the atmosphere, every note of tension vibrating in the air. This wasn't just some routine stop, it had never been one, and now, with hands near holsters, with voices sharpening, with the slow, creeping dread rising in Malcolm's chest, it was clear that these men had already decided how this was going to go. Callaway's smirk had disappeared, replaced with something colder, more calculating. "Control your damn dog." Malcolm exhaled slowly, keeping his hands raised, refusing to let the irritation break through, refusing to give them even an inch of what they wanted. "Rex is under control, he hasn't moved, he's on a leash, he's trained, and he hasn't attacked. The only aggression here is coming from you. I don't give a damn what you think, boy." Miller snapped, his voice cutting through the space between them like the crack of a whip. I said, control your damn dog. Malcolm's fingers twitched, not out of anger, no, he had buried that emotion deep, locked it away in the part of him that had learned long ago that losing his temper in moments like these could be a death sentence. It was discipline, calculation, training that told him that right now, every movement, every breath, every single thing he did was a potential trigger for something he couldn't undo. Officers, please, I am complying, Malcolm said carefully, lowering his voice just slightly, trying to take some of the heat out of the moment. You saw my ID, you know I live here, my dog is restrained, I am not resisting, so tell me, what exactly do you need from me right now? Callaway took a step closer, his hand still twitching near his holster, his expression twisting into something Malcolm recognized instantly. He wasn't just looking for compliance, he was looking for an excuse. You think this is a game? Callaway sneered, his voice rising now. You think we give a damn what you think? I don't care who you are, where you live, or what you do right now, you're a threat, and that mutt of yours, a damn liability. Miller moved another inch forward, his boots grinding against the pavement. You want to keep talking, or you want to do what the hell you're told? Rex let out a low, warning growl. Malcolm shifted his weight slightly, angling himself just enough to keep the officers in view while also maintaining his control over Rex. You're escalating this situation, officers. I am standing still, my dog is standing still, the only aggression here is coming from you, stand down now. Miller barked, his voice sharp, commanding, filled with something just a little too eager, stand down. Malcolm's heart pounded, not in fear, but in frustration, in the suffocating knowledge that there was nothing he could say, no amount of reason that would shift the path they had chosen for this moment. Callaway gestured aggressively at the ground, put that mutt down, make him sit now. Malcolm kept his movements slow, calculated. He turned his head just slightly, giving a quiet, controlled command, Rex, down. Immediately, Rex lowered himself to the ground, his body stiff but obedient, his ears flicking back slightly, sensing the forced nature of the order. Miller scoffed, shaking his head, oh, now you want to listen? Callaway wasn't satisfied, his hand dropped lower toward his holster, leash, shorten it, make sure he can't move. Malcolm's jaw clenched, but he obeyed, gripping the leash closer, keeping Rex locked in place, his breathing steady, his focus unwavering. Callaway exchanged a glance with Miller, something silent passed between them, something unspoken but heavy, an agreement, a decision. Miller exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders like he was shaking out tension. We're done playing around, turn around, hands behind your back. Malcolm stiffened, his voice dropped to something lower, quieter, but still controlled, I've done nothing wrong. Callaway's smirk returned, yeah, and yet, here we are. Malcolm didn't move, he knew what would happen if he turned around. The moment he gave them his back, he'd be in cuffs, shoved against the pavement, and whatever excuse they wanted to use afterward would be built off the fact that he resisted even though he hadn't. Turn around. Miller ordered again, taking a step forward. Rex let out a deep, rolling growl. Both officers' hands shot to their guns, control your damn dog. Miller shouted. Malcolm's voice snapped, sharp and authoritative, he is controlled. Not good enough. Callaway yelled back, his fingers tightening on his weapon. Malcolm felt the shift. The moment before the moment, the hairs on the back of his neck rose, the air seemed to still, the heat of the sun suddenly distant, the world shrinking to just this space, this street, these men who had never once intended to let him walk away from this moment with his dignity intact. Miller moved first, his hand jerked toward his gun. Rex reacted before Malcolm could even process the movement, a defensive instinct, a split-second reaction. The very thing the officers had been waiting for. A single bark, sharp, quick, a warning, then the shift of muscle as Rex tensed. Malcolm barely had time to process the movement before it happened. The gunshot rang out, splitting through the air like a crack of thunder. The leash jerked in Malcolm's hand, and then Rex stumbled. The world slowed, the sound of blood roaring in Malcolm's ears drowned out everything else, the officer shouts, the distant noise of a car engine, the voices of unseen neighbors who had been watching from the safety of their windows. All he saw was Rex's body jerking back, the shock in his dark brown eyes, the way his legs faltered beneath him as his body gave way. No! Malcolm's voice didn't even sound like his own, his knees hit the pavement before he even realized he had moved. Rex collapsed against him, his weight heavy, too heavy, and Malcolm's hands were suddenly slick with warmth, with life slipping away far too fast. A low, pained whimper escaped from Rex's throat, his breathing shallow, uneven. Miller still had his gun raised, his face a twisted mask of self-satisfaction and mock surprise. Callaway simply shook his head, exhaling through his nose. Told you he was a liability. Malcolm barely heard them, everything inside him went still. He barely registered the voices around him, barely processed the shift in movement, the shuffle of boots against pavement, the crackle of a distant radio transmission. His entire world had shrunk to the warm, crumpling weight in his arms, to the sharp, ragged breaths tearing through Rex's throat, to the way his dog, his companion, his brother in arms, his protector, was struggling against the inevitable, refusing to let go even as his body failed him. "Stay with me," Malcolm whispered, his voice raw, hoarse, breaking on the edges. His hands pressed desperately against the wound, warm blood seeping between his fingers, pooling onto the pavement, staining his clothes, his skin. The world around him turned red as his vision blurred with something hotter, darker, more consuming than anything he had ever felt before. "I got you, boy, stay with me, please." Rex's eyes were still on him, still alert, still searching his face, as if waiting for a command, waiting for direction. But there was no battlefield, no mission, no threat to eliminate, just pain, just confusion, just the deep, unspoken bond between them unraveling too fast for Malcolm to stop it. He could feel the tremors racking through Rex's body, the rapid, panicked rise and fall of his chest, the small, strangled sounds escaping from his throat, as if he wanted to respond, to tell Malcolm he was still fighting, that he would always fight. But the strength was fading, slipping like sand through Malcolm's grasp, like something he had no power to hold on to. You're okay," Malcolm muttered, his hands shaking as he stroked Rex's head, his fingers slipping over the damp fur, cradling his dog's face as if he could keep him grounded, keep him near. "You're strong, buddy, just hold on, just damn it, Rex, don't you quit on me." The officers were talking, he could hear them, but they didn't matter, their voices were nothing but distant, meaningless noise, like the buzzing of insects, irrelevant and hollow against the sound of Rex's slowing breaths, against the pulse of rage rising in Malcolm's chest like a tidal wave, violent and uncontainable. Then Rex let out a final, shallow exhale, and his body went still. Something inside Malcolm snapped. He lifted his head, eyes burning, blood smeared across his hands, his forearms, his clothes. His breathing hitched, then turned to something deeper, rougher, jagged with fury. His entire body trembled, but it wasn't with grief, it was something else, something hotter, something breaking loose from the deepest part of him, something primal, something that had been chained down for too damn long. "You!" His voice was a growl, a threat, an unfiltered burst of hatred coiling around his words, barely contained, barely human. He surged upward, pushing away from Rex's still body, his hands clenching into fists, his entire stance shifting, rigid, braced, ready. "You killed him." Miller flinched, but Callaway just sneered, shaking his head like he was dismissing a child's tantrum. "That's on you, big guy, should have controlled your damn dog." The world turned red. Malcolm lunged, not thinking, not planning, just moving, just acting, just giving into the raw, vicious, undeniable fury tearing through every inch of him. He wanted to feel his fists sink into flesh, wanted to break something, wanted to tear them apart the way they had just torn his world apart. The sharp, brutal snap of electricity slammed into his spine, his entire body seized, muscles locking, nerves igniting and blinding, unbearable pain as the taser voltage ripped through him, stealing his breath, stealing his strength, sending him crashing back to the ground. His body convulsed, pain exploding through every nerve, his vision white-hot with agony, his jaw locking as the current overpowered every thought, every instinct, leaving him helpless, thrashing against the pavement, unable to move, unable to do anything but feel. And then they were on him, boots pressing against his arms, against his back, pistols leveled at his head, voices shouting, demanding, barking orders like he was some wild animal they needed to put down. "Stay down, don't you move, hands behind your back now." Malcolm gasped, choking on his own breath, rage and grief crashing into his chest like a wrecking ball. Every part of him screamed to fight back, to break free, to do something, anything, but submit. But they had guns, they had already killed Rex, and if he moved again, if he gave them even the slightest excuse, they'd do the same to him. His body trembled, his muscles still twitching from the taser, but he forced his arms behind his back, his fists clenching so tightly his nails dug into his own palms, hard enough to draw blood. The weight of a knee pressed between his shoulder blades, grinding him down, suffocating, humiliating. "Yeah, that's right," Callaway muttered, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "That's where you belong." Malcolm let out a raw, guttural scream. It wasn't a sound of pain, it was rage, pure and undiluted, thick with grief, with helplessness, with a fury so deep it felt like it would burn him alive. "You killed him," he roared, his voice cracking, breaking, shattering under the weight of everything that was spiraling out of control. "You murdered him." His voice was hoarse, but he kept yelling, kept screaming, as if he could force the world to listen, as if he could undo what had just been done through sheer force of will. But no one listened. Callaway yanked him up by his arms, the metal of the cuffs biting into his wrists, his grip rough, punishing. Miller holstered his weapon, watching with something between amusement and indifference as Malcolm was dragged toward the squad car, his body still trembling with unspent rage, with grief too big to contain. He fought against it, against the hands shoving him forward, against the injustice burning like fire in his throat, against the unbearable reality that Rex was gone, that his best friend had just died in his arms, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. But the metal door slammed shut behind him, and he was trapped, alone. The sound of his own ragged, furious breathing was the only thing left, and then, slowly, something else settled in, something colder, something sharper, something that felt like steel locking into place. They thought this was over, they thought they had won, but Malcolm wasn't just some man on a walk with his dog, he was in the Delta Force, and one way or another, he was going to burn their world to the ground. The cold steel of the handcuffs dug into Malcolm's wrists, biting deeper with every shift of the vehicle as it rumbled down the road, siren silent, its passengers indifferent to the man shackled in the back. His chest still heaved, his breath uneven, his pulse a war drum hammering against his ribs. His entire body was a raw, frayed nerve that hadn't stopped vibrating since the moment that gunshot had shattered the world. His fingers twitched against the unforgiving metal, muscles still spasming from the lingering effects of the taser, the aftershocks of forced compliance still pulsing through his veins. His jaw ached from how tightly he had been clenching his teeth, his throat raw from the screams they had ignored, from the pure, undiluted rage that had poured from his soul and yet had done nothing to change the fact that Rex was gone. He could still feel the weight of him, still see those dark eyes filled with loyalty, filled with trust, looking at him in those final moments, waiting for a command, waiting for him to fix it, to protect him, to stop the inevitable from happening. He had never felt so powerless. The cruiser jerked to a stop, the doors swung open and Callaway's hand wrapped around his arm like he was dragging a corpse from a ditch, yanking him forward with a force that sent a jolt of pain shooting through his shoulders. The moment his boots hit the ground, Malcolm forced his body to steady itself, forced the tremor in his limbs to vanish, forced himself to bury the raw, burning storm still clawing at his insides. Not here, not now. They wanted a reaction, they had gotten one when Rex fell, they wouldn't get another. Miller smirked as he stepped out, adjusting his belt with casual arrogance, the kind of swagger that came from knowing he could take a life in broad daylight and suffer no consequences. "Welcome to your new home for the night," he drawled, giving Malcolm's shoulder a hard shove toward the station doors. "Try not to get too comfortable." Malcolm didn't respond, he kept his posture straight, his eyes forward, his mind reeling, calculating, searching for a way through the fog of rage that had settled in his chest like a dying fire, still smoldering, waiting to ignite. The booking process was a blur of cold fingers snapping off his cuffs, of ink pressed against his skin, of fluorescent lights humming above him as the weight of everything settled in his bones. His mugshot was taken with Rex's blood still on his clothes, on his hands, the evidence of his loss turned into nothing more than another box checked on a form that meant nothing. They led him to a holding cell, a small, stale room that smelled of sweat and old regret, its walls lined with the ghosts of men who had sat there before him, staring at the same cracks in the ceiling, wondering how they had ended up on the wrong side of justice. Malcolm didn't sit, didn't pace, didn't close his eyes, he waited. Time blurred, minutes bled into hours, the anger didn't fade, but it shifted, cooling, hardening into something different, something more dangerous. And then the door opened, a familiar voice, firm, clipped, burning with barely restrained fury, "Get your damn hands off of him." "Jasmine." Malcolm exhaled slowly as his sister stormed into the room, her heels striking the tile like gunfire, her presence a force of nature that even the officers escorting her seemed reluctant to challenge. She was dressed in full defense mode power suit, sharp angles, a glare so sharp it could slice through bone. "You're done holding him," she snapped, shoving a stack of papers into the nearest officer's chest without looking at him. "Unless you want the lawsuit of the century, I suggest you unchain your egos from this moment and let him walk out of here." Callaway appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, amusement flickering in his gaze. "Relax, sweetheart," he said, voice oozing false charm. We were just having a conversation with your brother, had a little misunderstanding earlier. Jasmine turned so fast her hair barely had time to catch up. A misunderstanding, she repeated, her tone a loaded weapon. Is that what we're calling it now? Miller leaned against the doorway, grinning. He got aggressive. Ma'am, we had to make sure things didn't escalate. Jasmine's laugh was sharp, humorless. You mean you shot his dog, assaulted him, and threw him in a cell because you thought he looked out of place in his own neighborhood? Callaway shrugged. Could have gone worse. The temperature in the room dropped. Malcolm finally spoke, his voice quieter than it had been all night, but laced with something that made even Callaway's smirk flicker. It will. For the first time, the officers hesitated, just for a second, then Callaway snorted, shaking his head. Take him home, counselor, but I tell him to keep his head down if I were you. This city isn't too kind to troublemakers. Jasmine's eyes burned, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned to Malcolm, her fingers wrapping around his wrist, her grip firm, steady, the first anchor he had felt since this nightmare began. Let's go, she said softly. Malcolm followed her out past the other officers who barely spared him a glance, past the walls that had already erased him, past the men who believed they had won. The night air hit his skin, but it didn't feel freeing, nothing did. Jasmine exhaled, rubbing a hand over her face before turning to him, her expression shifting from fury to something heavier, something laced with grief. I'm sorry, she whispered. I know what he meant to you. Malcolm's jaw tensed, but he didn't respond. He couldn't, the words weren't there, not in a language that could express what had been ripped from him. But Jasmine wasn't done. You need to let me handle this, she continued, her voice firm, pleading. You need to let me take this through the courts, through the media, through every legal damn avenue we have. It won't work, Malcolm said quietly. Jasmine hesitated. Malcolm, it won't work, and they both knew it. The police owned the system, they controlled the narrative, they had already set it in motion, already buried any chance of accountability beneath layers of bureaucracy and false reports and manufactured justifications. The courts wouldn't save him, the law wouldn't save him, justice wasn't coming, not the kind Jasmine was hoping for. And so, Malcolm did something he hadn't done in years. He let go of the idea that the system would protect him, and he let something else settle in, something colder, something inevitable. Days later, the house was silent, not the peaceful kind of silence, not the sort of quiet that came with solitude or rest. This was absence, the kind of silence that clawed at the edges of a man's mind, that sat heavy in the air, pressing in from all sides, the kind that made the world feel off balance, like something had been torn away and left nothing in its place. Malcolm sat at his kitchen table, staring at his hands, his fingers resting loosely around a coffee mug he hadn't touched. Rex's leash sat coiled on the counter, the absence of weight at his side, of movement in the room, of quiet, steady breaths that weren't his own, left a void so deep it felt like the floor itself would give way beneath him. Jasmine stood by the window, arms crossed, watching him carefully. You haven't slept. Malcolm didn't answer. You haven't eaten either, she added, her voice soft, careful. Still no response. Jasmine sighed, dragging a hand down her face before stepping closer. I know what you're thinking. That made him exhale, a slow, humorless sound that barely registered as a laugh. He finally looked up at her, his eyes dark, tired, hollow in a way that hadn't been there before. Do you? Jasmine hesitated, something unreadable flickering across her face. They had always been close, had always understood each other in ways most siblings didn't, but now, as she looked at him, as she saw the shift that had taken place, she wasn't sure if she recognized what she saw. I know you, she said carefully. I know how you operate. I know that if something doesn't make sense, if something is broken, you fix it. If there's an enemy, you eliminate it. That's how you've always been, that's why you were so good at what you did. Her voice softened. But this isn't a battlefield, Malcolm. His jaw clenched. Feels like one. She exhaled, stepping closer, lowering her voice as if gentleness alone could reach him, could pull him back from wherever he was slipping into. Listen to me, the system is slow, but that doesn't mean it's useless. We're filing a case. I have connections with reporters, activists, watchdogs. This isn't going to just go away. People will hear about what happened, the pressure will build, and they'll have to act. Malcolm's gaze didn't waver. No, they won't. Yes, they will. It takes time, but it works. They already closed the internal investigation, Jasmine. Her breath hitched, her hands curling into fists. What? Malcolm's voice was calm, detached in a way that didn't match the fire in his eyes. they wrapped it up this morning. No misconduct, no disciplinary action, no charges, justified force. Jasmine's entire body tensed, her expression twisting between disbelief and fury. She cut herself off, pacing toward the window, pressing a hand against her forehead as if physically holding back the words that wanted to escape. Of course they did, of course they. She turned back, her voice sharp. That doesn't mean we're done. We can appeal, we can take this higher, we can. No, Jasmine, his voice was steady, final. She shook her head. No, you don't get to say that, not after what they did, not after what they took from you. This isn't over. Malcolm leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, his fingers lacing together, his gaze never leaving hers. They took everything from me in a matter of seconds, but you're telling me to wait, to hope that the same system that let them walk free will suddenly find accountability it's never had before? You're telling me that if I sit still, if I trust the process, maybe in 6 months or a year there might be a hearing, a slap on the wrist, a forced resignation, maybe. But Jasmine, you and I both know exactly how this plays out. Her throat bobbed, her breath unsteady. We have to at least try. I did try, he said, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. I tried the moment they put me in cuffs. I tried when I told them I lived here. I tried when I showed them my ID. I tried when I stood still, when I spoke politely, when I didn't resist, when I begged them to see me as human. I tried, Jasmine, his voice faltered just slightly, and Rex still died, and I still went to jail. Jasmine clenched her jaw, her eyes shining with something between frustration and sorrow. Malcolm leaned back, exhaling slowly. I'm done trying. She stepped forward, lowering herself into the chair across from him, searching his face. What are you saying? Malcolm tilted his head slightly, as if contemplating the weight of the words before speaking them aloud. I think you already know. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table. Malcolm, I'm not asking you to be okay with it. He cut in, his voice still impossibly calm, too steady for what he was about to say. I'm just telling you where I stand, and where this is going. Jasmine's breath trembled, her eyes searching his face for something. Doubt, hesitation, a sign that there was still a path she could lead him down, still a way to turn him from whatever was unfolding in his mind. But she saw nothing, just resolve, cold, unshakable, unwavering. She swallowed hard, her voice quiet, brittle. If you do this, there's no coming back. Malcolm held her gaze. I don't want to come back. A silence stretched between them, thick with everything they weren't saying. Finally, Jasmine exhaled, slow and measured, before standing, smoothing out her jacket with steady hands. I'll call you tomorrow. Malcolm nodded. She hesitated for just a second longer, her fingers twitching slightly at her sides, as if she wanted to reach out, wanted to grab him, shake him, pull him back to the brother she knew before all of this, but instead, she turned and walked out the door. Malcolm waited until the sound of her car engine faded into the distance before he rose from his seat, moving toward the counter. His hands hovered over Rex's leash, his fingers brushing over the worn leather, tracing the familiar feel of it, the weight of memory embedded in every inch. Then, slowly, deliberately, he picked it up and coiled it tightly in his palm, not as a leash, not as something that would ever be used again for what it was meant for, but as a reminder, a promise. A war was coming, and Malcolm was ready. The bar sat at the edge of the city, far from the well-lit streets where Callaway's uniform still carried weight. Here, nobody cared that he was a cop. Here, he could be exactly the kind of man he had always been: reckless, arrogant, unafraid. Malcolm had been watching him for days, learning the rhythm of his vices, the way he drifted into the same seat at the bar like clockwork, the way he leaned in too close to women who weren't his wife, the way he tossed back whiskey like it was water, drowning himself in the filth of his own existence. He had no idea he was being hunted. Malcolm sat in the corner of the bar, hood low, his drink untouched, as he watched Callaway stumble his way through another night of indulgence. The man was predictable, and predictability was a weakness. He had parked in the same alley behind the bar, the one with no security cameras, no streetlights, the perfect place for a man to disappear for a few minutes without anyone noticing. Malcolm was going to make sure Callaway disappeared just long enough for his world to start crumbling. Callaway laughed loudly, a crude, obnoxious sound, slapping the back of the bartender like they were old friends. He swayed slightly, his balance compromised from the 5 drinks he had already downed, his words slurred but confident, like a man who believed nothing bad could ever happen to him. Malcolm exhaled slowly, finishing his drink in one slow sip before rising to his feet. He let Callaway move first, let him feel the false sense of security that came from being in familiar territory. Callaway didn't even glance around as he stumbled toward the back exit, muttering something under his breath as he pushed through the door, stepping into the dark alley beyond. The moment the door swung shut behind him, the game began. Malcolm followed, silent as a shadow, his breath steady, his pulse slow, his muscles coiled with the kind of patience only men like him knew how to wield. Callaway had no idea he wasn't alone. The cop fumbled with his keys, cursing as they slipped from his fingers, clattering against the pavement. He grunted, leaning forward to retrieve them. Malcolm struck a hard, precise kick to the ribs, sending Callaway crashing to the ground, his head bouncing against the pavement with a sickening crack. The man let out a sharp gasp, hands scrambling against the concrete, his confusion instant and absolute. What the? Malcolm didn't let him finish. A steel-toed boot slammed into his stomach, knocking the air from his lungs, leaving him gasping like a fish on dry land. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion, no mercy. Malcolm grabbed Callaway by the collar, dragging him up just to slam him back down, the back of his skull bouncing off the asphalt again, dazing him, leaving him too disoriented to fight back. Callaway groaned, his body limp, his fingers clawing at Malcolm's arms, desperate, weak. Who? Malcolm grabbed a fistful of his hair and yanked his head back, bringing his mouth close to the man's ear, his voice a whisper, low and deadly. You don't get to know who I am, he murmured. Not yet. Callaway shuddered. Malcolm released him, letting him drop hard against the pavement. He stood over him, watching as the man tried to move, tried to make sense of what was happening, tried to pull himself together. It was useless. Malcolm crouched down, tilting his head slightly, his voice still eerily calm. You like to play judge, jury, and executioner, don't you? He mused. It's easy when you've got a badge, isn't it? Easy when you've got a system that protects you, when no one ever fights back. Callaway sucked in a sharp, trembling breath, his hands curling into fists. You're dead, you hear me? His voice wavered, shaking beneath the bravado. You don't. The next punch was swift, calculated, sending blood splattering across the pavement. That was for all my black brothers and sisters you've harassed and beat, he said. Callaway choked, spitting red onto the ground, his body curling inward. Malcolm let the silence stretch, let the pain settle in deep before speaking again, his voice softer this time, but no less terrifying. This is the last time you ever walk away from something like this, he said, because after tonight, I'm going to take everything from you, your job, your reputation, your family, your safety, and when there's nothing left, you'll wake up every day knowing that somewhere out there, I'm watching you. Callaway let out a choked, ragged breath. Malcolm leaned in. This is just the beginning, and then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. Callaway remained on the ground, bleeding, shaking, his heart pounding with a terror he had never felt before. For the first time in his life, he was the one being hunted. Callaway lay on the ground, his body aching in ways he had never experienced before. Pain was something he had always inflicted, never something he had to endure. But now, the pavement beneath him felt like quicksand, every attempt to move sending sharp reminders of the blows he had taken. His ribs screamed with each shallow breath, his face was slick with his own blood, and his head throbbed so violently he thought he might pass out. His fingers trembled as he pressed his palms against the pavement, trying to push himself up. His vision swam, street lights blurring into hazy orange halos, his heartbeat pounding in his ears, drowning out the distant sounds of traffic from the main road. The alley was empty, silent. Whoever had done this to him was gone, and yet Callaway felt no relief. The man's words echoed in his skull, low and measured, cutting deeper than any of the blows he had landed. This is the last time you ever walk away from something like this, because after tonight, I'm going to take everything from you. A slow, unsteady breath rasped through Callaway's throat, his stomach twisting in a way that had nothing to do with his injuries. There had been something unnatural about the way the man spoke, so certain, so absolute, like he wasn't just making threats but promising inevitabilities, and the worst part, Callaway believed him. With a grunt, he forced himself upright, his legs shaking beneath his weight, his back pressed against the brick wall for support, his fingers fumbling against his pocket for his phone. The screen was cracked, smeared with blood, but it still worked. He dialed, it rang twice before a voice answered. Jesus, Callaway, it's 1 a.m, Miller's voice grumbled, thick with exhaustion. What the hell do you? I need backup, Callaway rasped, cutting him off, his breath uneven now. A pause, then a sigh. Where are you? Back alley behind O'Malley's, Callaway muttered, reaching up to wipe the blood from his brow. Some son of a jumped me, didn't see his face. He hesitated, the words getting caught in his throat. He had never hesitated before. He what? Miller's voice was sharper now, more alert. Callaway swallowed, licking his cracked lips. He knew me, Miller. He knew my name, he knew everything. Another pause. Longer this time. Everything? He said. Callaway exhaled, squeezing his eyes shut for a moment before opening them again. He said he's going to ruin me, that he's going to take everything from me. Miller scoffed, but there was a flicker of unease beneath the dismissal. Probably some drunk idiot trying to talk big. You're still standing, aren't you? Callaway forced a bitter laugh, but it felt hollow. You don't get it, this guy wasn't some thug looking for a fight, this was different. Miller groaned, the sound of rustling sheets and movement coming through the phone. All right, sit tight, I'll be there in 10. The call ended. Callaway leaned his head back against the wall, staring up at the dark sky above him, his chest tightening with something unfamiliar. It wasn't just anger, it wasn't just pain, it was fear. For the first time in his life, he wasn't in control. Miller arrived exactly when he said he would, pulling into the alley with his unmarked car, headlights washing over Callaway's battered form. He stepped out, dressed in casual clothes, his badge hanging from his belt, his gun at his hip. The hell happened to you? Miller muttered, taking in the sight of him. Callaway groaned, pushing himself off the wall. You think I did this to myself? Miller gave him a once-over before glancing around the alley, scanning the shadows. You said you didn't see his face? No, Callaway muttered, flexing his fingers, wincing at the soreness. He came out of nowhere, moved fast, knew exactly where to hit, military fast. Miller frowned. So what? Some pissed-off veteran with a grudge. Callaway exhaled sharply. I don't know, but he wasn't just some random guy looking to start trouble. He knew me, he knew about us, he knew what we've done. Miller's expression darkened, his jaw tightened. Then we find him. Callaway let out a humorless laugh. Yeah. And how do you plan on doing that? We don't even have a description. Miller stepped closer, voice low. Someone comes after us, we shut it down, that's how this works. Whoever this guy is, he made a mistake, he left you alive, that means he left an opening. Callaway was silent for a moment, then nodded, forcing himself to straighten. Yeah, you're right. Miller glanced at his phone. I'll make some calls, see if we can find anything. Callaway nodded again, but his mind was still trapped in the alley, still replaying every word his attacker had spoken. This is just the beginning. Miller clapped him on the shoulder, but Callaway barely felt it. Somewhere out there, the man who had done this to him was watching, waiting, planning, and Callaway knew with a certainty that sent ice through his veins that he had already lost control. Malcolm had expected them to retaliate, but what interested him was how they would respond. He had anticipated panic, the erratic desperation of men who believed themselves untouchable, only to realize that something unseen, something stronger, had set its sights on them. They had spent years preying on the weak, operating under the illusion that their authority was absolute, that their uniforms shielded them from consequences. Now, stripped of their security, forced to reckon with the reality that they were being hunted, they had no idea where to begin, so they did what men like them always did, they found someone else to blame. Malcolm sat in his car across the street, engine off, his seat reclined just enough to avoid drawing attention, his camera lens trained on Callaway and Miller as they moved with the kind of aggression that only came from fear. They weren't handling this the way an officer would handle an investigation. No interviews, no proper protocol, no reports being filed. This was retaliation. Callaway was still limping slightly, a bruise creeping from beneath his collar, his face stiff with pain, but it wasn't just the beating that had broken him, it was the unknown. He had been attacked in a way he had never experienced before, helpless, powerless, beaten in the shadows without ever seeing the man who had done it, and that had shaken him deeper than any bruise ever could. They had stopped outside a rundown boxing gym, the kind that never advertised, the kind built for fighters who didn't just train for sport but for survival. It wasn't surprising. Callaway and Miller had a long history of targeting strong, outspoken black men in their precinct, men they viewed as a challenge, men who never bowed their heads. Malcolm's eyes flicked toward the entrance of the gym as the door swung open, revealing a familiar face. Terran Briggs, tall, built like a linebacker, his presence commanded attention without effort. He was a well-known figure in the community, a former amateur fighter turned youth mentor, one of the few men who had always stood up against exactly the kind of officers Callaway and Miller were. Malcolm remembered reading about the time Briggs had filed excessive force complaints against them 2 years ago after a violent, baseless arrest. The charges had been buried beneath red tape, dismissed as resisting arrest, but Malcolm had seen the photos, the bruises on Briggs' ribs, the split in his eyebrow, the raw abrasions on his wrists from the cuffs that had been tightened just a little too much. And now, Callaway and Miller were back, staring him down like they were searching for something, their eyes sharp, expectant. Malcolm lifted his camera, zooming in, and the conversation was tense from the start. Callaway stood too close, his arms crossed, his chin tilted upward in the kind of posture that dared a man to retaliate. Miller kept shifting his weight, glancing at the street like he expected someone to be watching. Briggs wasn't intimidated, he never had been. He leaned against the doorframe of the gym, wiping sweat from his brow, his expression unimpressed as Callaway spoke. Malcolm couldn't hear them, but he didn't need to. The body language told him everything. Callaway was demanding something, his gestures sharp, impatient. Briggs shook his head, then smirked, saying something that made Miller step forward, teeth bared in frustration. Briggs pushed off the doorframe, standing taller, making it clear that he wasn't backing down. Malcolm adjusted the lens, capturing every second. Miller took another step, but Callaway put a hand on his chest, stopping him. He turned back to Briggs, his expression darkening, a warning. Briggs didn't flinch, he just laughed. Callaway's hands clenched at his sides, but he said nothing else. He turned on his heel, motioning for Miller to follow. They left without another word, their shoulders stiff, their pace tight. Malcolm exhaled, lowering the camera just slightly, so that was their plan. They had no leads, no idea who was responsible, so they were going to find the strongest black men in the community and shake them down, waiting to see who flinched. Cowards. Malcolm watched as Briggs muttered something under his breath, shaking his head before heading back inside the gym. Callaway and Miller, however, weren't finished. They got into their car, and Malcolm tailed them, keeping 3 cars behind, always in their blind spots. They weren't looking for him, they weren't careful. The next stop was the apartment complex where Dwayne Carter lived. Malcolm knew that name. Carter had been another victim of Callaway and Miller's abuse, pulled over on a bogus traffic stop 6 months ago, dragged out of his car, accused of having a weapon that had never existed. He had been arrested, beaten in the holding cell, charged with assaulting an officer, even though the only injuries that night had been his. Malcolm sat in silence, watching as Callaway and Miller approached the front door, knocking hard enough to rattle the frame. The door opened after a few seconds, and Carter appeared, rubbing his eyes, clearly just waking up. They didn't waste time. Callaway shoved the door open wider, stepping inside uninvited. Carter tensed, confusion morphing into irritation, but he didn't fight back, he knew better. Miller entered behind him, blocking the exit, forcing Carter back toward his own kitchen. Malcolm adjusted his camera, zooming in through the window. Their expressions were sharp, accusing. Carter was defensive, hands raised slightly in that universal sign of compliance. They were interrogating him. Malcolm's fingers tightened around the camera. Callaway said something, then pointed at Carter's arms, his physique, his posture. They were profiling him in real time, looking at his build, his strength, already deciding that it made him guilty of something. Carter's jaw clenched, and then he did something unexpected. He laughed. Callaway's face darkened instantly. Miller took a step forward, invading Carter's space. Malcolm took a deep breath, steadying his hands. He didn't need to intervene, not yet. This wasn't about stopping them in the moment, this was about documenting everything. He had everything he needed. They were digging their own graves, and Malcolm was going to bury them. Malcolm had followed them long enough to know their methods. Their fear had turned to desperation, and desperation made them reckless. They had no suspects, no direction, no tangible way to fight back against an enemy they couldn't see, so instead, they did what cowards did best. They attacked blindly, hoping to hit something. He watched from 3 cars behind as Callaway and Miller drove in tight circles through the city, stopping only to intimidate men they had once arrested, men they assumed might be capable of the kind of calculated brutality that had left Callaway broken and afraid. But fear had made them impatient, and impatience had made them sloppy. Malcolm knew what was coming before they did. They had been targeting men like Briggs and Carter because they had power, physical strength, the ability to fight back, but when that didn't get them any answers, they would switch tactics. They would look for someone else, someone like him. He saw it in the way Miller hesitated before turning onto a familiar street, in the way Callaway leaned forward, eyes narrowed as the house came into view. They thought they were being subtle, but Malcolm had been waiting for this moment. He had been preparing. They were coming for him, and they had no idea that he wanted them to. Malcolm had spent 2 nights preparing the house, not the obvious security measures, no, that would make them suspicious. Instead, he had staged it in a way that made him look vulnerable, a half-full whiskey bottle left visible on the coffee table, unopened mail stacked haphazard on the kitchen counter, a gun safe carefully left slightly ajar, just enough to suggest negligence. The cameras had been positioned perfectly, hidden in plain sight in places no cop would ever think to check, because they never thought they needed to. The front porch light was left on, the side gate unlocked, an invitation. Malcolm sat in his living room, his phone resting on his knee, his breathing steady as the knock came, sharp, demanding. He rose slowly, keeping his movements relaxed, keeping the illusion intact. The cameras were already recording. Another knock, this time harder. Malcolm unlocked the door, swinging it open to reveal Callaway and Miller standing on his porch. "Malcolm," he said, keeping his voice even. "Something I can help you with?" Callaway smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. There was no friendliness in it, just the thinly veiled pleasure of a man who thought he was back in control. "Mind if we come in?" Callaway asked. Malcolm leaned against the doorframe. "That depends. You got a warrant? You going to shoot me this time instead?" Miller chuckled. "You got something to hide?" Malcolm tilted his head, letting just enough amusement slip into his expression to keep them off guard. "Not at all, but I like to keep things legal, you understand." Callaway's smirk widened. "Yeah, legal, funny thing about that, isn't it?" Malcolm said nothing, just waited, and Callaway took the bait. Before Malcolm could react, not that he tried to, Callaway's hand was on his chest, shoving him back into the house. Malcolm staggered, knocking into the side table, the whiskey bottle clattering to the floor. He heard the door click shut behind them. Miller exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "You know what's funny, Malcolm? We've been looking into something real interesting stuff." Malcolm stayed where he was, keeping his body language relaxed, keeping his expression blank. "That's so." Callaway circled him like a predator that thought its prey was already beaten. "Yeah, see, we've been thinking, the guy who did this to me, he wasn't some street thug, he was trained, the way he moved, the way he hit, real professional stuff." Malcolm didn't react. "But here's the thing," Callaway continued, taking another slow step forward. "Not a lot of people are trained like that, unless, of course, they had the right kind of background." Miller leaned in, "Like Delta Force?" Malcolm let the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable, then he did exactly what he had planned. He laughed. It wasn't forced, it wasn't nervous, it was a slow, deep chuckle, one that made Callaway's expression flicker just slightly, the smallest crack in his confidence. "You think I beat your ass?" Malcolm asked, shaking his head, his amusement genuine. "Callaway, if I had, you wouldn't have walked away from it." Miller's jaw tightened, but Callaway recovered, tilting his head. "That's a real interesting response." Malcolm exhaled, rubbing his jaw like he was just another tired man trying to get through a conversation he wasn't interested in. "Look, I don't know what's going on with you two, but I had nothing to do with whatever happened to you." Callaway's smirk returned. "Yeah, well, see, we don't really believe you." Malcolm saw it before it happened, the shift in weight, the slight tensing of Callaway's shoulder, the way Miller's fingers curled into fists, and he didn't fight it. The first punch landed hard against his ribs, the impact sharp, brutal. Malcolm grunted, stumbling backward, but he didn't resist, didn't defend himself, he let it happen. Another punch, this time to his jaw, his head snapped to the side, pain radiating through his skull. His body wanted to react, to counter, to break them, but he kept his hands loose, his stance slack. Callaway grabbed the collar of his shirt, yanking him upright. "Not so tough now, are you?" Malcolm let his body sag just slightly, breathing heavy, playing the part perfectly. "You done?" he rasped. Miller sneered, "For now." Callaway shoved him hard against the wall, stepping back with a satisfied smirk. "Stay out of our way, Malcolm, because if we find out you had anything to do with this, you're not going to like how it ends." And just like that, they were gone. Malcolm stayed on the floor for a few seconds, his ribs throbbing, his lips split, his entire body screaming at him for letting them do it. Then, slowly, he got up. He walked to his laptop, pulled up the camera feeds, and there it was, everything he needed the moment Callaway and Miller had sealed their own fate. Malcolm sat in front of his laptop, the dim glow of the screen reflecting in his eyes as he replayed the footage. The bruises on his face had already started to fade, but the ache in his ribs still lingered, a dull, constant reminder of what he had endured to set this up. Every punch, every shove, every smug insult from Callaway and Miller had been necessary. Now, he was about to make sure it all paid off. He watched as the video played out again. The clarity was perfect, the camera placement had been meticulous, ensuring that there was no ambiguity. The moment Callaway pushed his way inside, the moment Miller closed the door behind him, the moment their arrogance, their unchecked power, was laid bare. Malcolm exhaled slowly. The first step had been getting them to act on instinct, the second was making sure their instincts got them killed. He opened a secured folder on his computer, scanning the collection of files, images and reports he had compiled over the last few weeks. Every unjustified arrest, every excessive force complaint, every time a victim had been silenced. Callaway and Miller weren't just corrupt officers, they were the rot inside the department, the kind of men who thought power was their birthright, and now, he was going to take it away from them. He drafted the first email, attaching a carefully edited version of the footage, not everything, not yet, just enough to stir the pot. The footage would circulate, it would spread to the right eyes, the ones inside the department who had been waiting for an excuse to purge their ranks but had never had enough evidence. Malcolm wasn't giving them evidence, he was giving them a weapon. He leaned back, cracking his knuckles, exhaling slowly. The emails were sent, the storm was coming, but first, Miller still needed a beating. Malcolm had spent days studying Miller's schedule, tracking him the same way he had Callaway, but unlike Callaway, Miller wasn't reckless, he was angry, twitchy, looking over his shoulder, gripping his gun a little tighter than before. Callaway had taken the first blow, and Miller knew he was next, but that wouldn't save him. Malcolm watched from the driver's seat of his car, parked a safe distance away from a bar Miller had been frequenting for the last few nights, not a place cops usually drank. This was a dive, a hole in the wall where no one asked questions. Miller had been there for 3 hours. Malcolm knew why. The man was unraveling. The department had been whispering, there were rumors that internal affairs had been asking about Callaway, about past arrests, about misconduct complaints. Miller wasn't stupid, he knew if Callaway went down, he was going with him. Malcolm had made sure of that. He tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, his mind already working through the next steps. He didn't need to trick Miller into a fight the way he had with Callaway, he just needed to wait until the bastard was drunk enough to make a mistake, and Miller was getting there. The door to the bar swung open, and Miller stumbled out, shoulders hunched, tension etched into every line of his body. He looked like a man walking toward a noose. Malcolm exhaled slowly, rolling his neck. It was time. He exited the car, keeping his steps measured, silent. He let Miller move first, waiting, watching, following. The drunk cop wasn't heading home, he was too restless, too pissed off. Instead, he was walking through the alley behind the bar, a shortcut to the parking lot where his car was waiting. Malcolm followed him into the dark. He had chosen the location, now he was choosing the moment. He let Miller take a few more steps before finally speaking. Long night, Miller. Miller froze. Malcolm saw the way the man's shoulders tensed, his body going stiff, his instincts screaming at him that something was wrong. Slowly, Miller turned, his eyes narrowing in confusion before flickering with recognition. You, he muttered. Malcolm didn't move. You look tired. Miller's fingers twitched near his waistband, near the gun he had no doubt been keeping close since Callaway's attack. What the hell do you want? Malcolm tilted his head slightly, keeping his voice calm. I want you to understand something. Miller sneered. Yeah, and what's that? Malcolm took a slow step forward. You're done. Miller stiffened, the silence between them stretched, thick, electric. Then Miller scoffed, shaking his head, forcing out a laugh. You're real confident for a guy who let us use him as a punching bag. Malcolm exhaled slowly. Yeah, funny thing about that. Miller's smirk faltered just slightly. Malcolm took another step forward. Callaway was just the beginning, he said, his voice softer now, almost casual, but I'm going to take my time with you. Miller's nostrils flared, his hand jerking toward his gun. He never got the chance to pull it. Malcolm struck first, fast, precise, and then Miller was falling. The last thing he saw was Malcolm standing over him, waiting for him to get up so they could really get started. Miller hit the pavement hard, the impact rattling through his bones, his lungs gasping for air that refused to come. The moment his body crumpled, he knew this wasn't like Callaway's beating, this wasn't a message, this was personal. He tried to push himself up, but before he could move, a boot slammed down on his wrist, grinding his hand into the rough asphalt. Pain flared white-hot up his arm, and he let out a strangled grunt. Stay down, Malcolm said. Miller recognized the voice. Even through the haze of adrenaline and the ringing in his ears, he knew exactly who it was, and for the first time in his miserable, pathetic life, he felt real fear. He struggled anyway, his instincts kicking in, years of unchecked aggression telling him to fight, to take control, to dominate, but he was too slow, too drunk, too reliant on a badge that wasn't here to save him. Malcolm moved first, his fist driving into Miller's ribs, heart a perfect, precise strike between bone and muscle, designed to hurt, designed to linger. Miller choked on the breath that had been ripped from him, wheezing as his body seized from the impact. "You remember me now, don't you?" Malcolm murmured, his voice impossibly calm, measured. Miller coughed, trying to twist free, but Malcolm grabbed him by the collar, yanking him upright just enough so they were face to face. "Look at me," Malcolm ordered. Miller's swollen eyes blinked up at him, his breath ragged, his lips cracked with blood. Recognition flickered, followed by horror. "You," he rasped. Malcolm's grip tightened. "Say my name." Miller swallowed, his throat clicking in the silence. "You don't want to, do you?" Malcolm continued, "Because if you say my name, it means you know exactly why this is happening, it means you remember what you did." Miller's jaw clenched, defiant even as his body betrayed him, shaking beneath Malcolm's grip. Malcolm exhaled sharply, then leaned in, voice low, deadly. "You shot my dog." Miller flinched. "You remember now, don't you?" Malcolm continued, his voice softer now, almost like he was speaking to a child. "I bet it felt real good at the time, didn't it? Real easy, just another kill, another thing you could do because no one was going to stop you." Miller coughed, his body shaking harder now, whether from pain or terror. Malcolm didn't care. "But I'm not like the people you target, Miller, you should have known that." Malcolm's grip tightened on his shirt, his voice turning cold. "I don't forget, I don't forgive, and I don't let things go." Miller tried to speak, tried to form words, but Malcolm didn't give him the chance. The next punch shattered his nose. Miller let out a garbled yell, blood gushing down his face, his body spasming from the sheer force of the impact, his head snapping back against the pavement, a wet, gurgling sound escaping his lips. Malcolm didn't stop, he made sure Miller felt every bit of what Rex had felt. Every kick, every punch, every ounce of suffering Miller had inflicted on others was repaid tenfold. By the time Malcolm finally let him go, Miller was a heap of broken flesh and shattered arrogance, but Malcolm wasn't finished. He crouched down beside him, his breath steady, his voice quiet. "This is just the beginning." Miller let out a low, trembling whimper. Malcolm's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smirk. "Remember how I said I don't forget?" Miller didn't answer, he was barely conscious. Malcolm stood, stepping back, leaving Miller sprawled in the filth of his own blood and failure. Good, and then, just like that, he was gone. By the time Miller clawed his way back to his car, Malcolm was exactly where he needed to be, inside a fully booked casino. It had been part of the plan all along. Malcolm walked through the lobby, passing security, letting the cameras catch every step, every angle, every detail of his face. He made small talk with the pit bosses, played a few hands of blackjack, even let himself lose a couple of rounds just to make sure he was memorable. Then, for the final touch, he walked right up to the bar, tapped his knuckles against the counter, and ordered the strongest drink they had. "Rough night?" the bartender asked. Malcolm let out a short, easy chuckle, something like that. He lifted the glass in a small toast, took a long sip, and smiled. "Let the whole damn casino see him, let every camera record him, let Miller crawl his way back to the precinct and scream his name into the void, because it wouldn't matter." By the time the cops pulled the security footage, by the time they went looking for proof, all they'd find was Malcolm Hayes sitting at a bar, sipping whiskey, surrounded by 100 people who could swear he hadn't left their sight all night. Miller knew the truth, Callaway would know too, but they couldn't prove a damn thing. That was the beauty of it. Malcolm drove home with the calm precision of a man who already knew what was waiting for him. He had played his part, set every piece exactly where it needed to be. The next move wasn't his, it was theirs. The flashing red and blue lights were visible before he even turned onto his street. 2 patrol cars parked at the curb, 4 officers standing near his driveway, one of them already looking toward his approaching vehicle. Malcolm exhaled slowly, not in surprise, not in fear, but in quiet satisfaction. They had taken the bait. He pulled into his driveway and shut off the engine, his movements controlled, deliberate, designed to show no resistance. The officers were already moving before he had even stepped out of the car. "Malcolm Hayes," one of them said, voice sharp, authoritative, rehearsed. Malcolm gave them an easy nod. "That's me." "Step out of the vehicle." Malcolm didn't argue, didn't hesitate. He unbuckled his seatbelt, opened the door, and stepped onto the pavement, his expression unreadable. One of the cops, a stocky officer with a tight jaw and an even tighter grip on his belt, stepped forward. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Malcolm's lips curled slightly. "You sure you want to do this?" The officer's face twitched, a flicker of uncertainty flashing in his eyes, but it was gone just as fast. "Do it now." Malcolm shrugged, then turned, letting them cuff him without so much as a word of protest. The cold steel bit into his wrists, but Malcolm barely felt it. Everything was happening exactly as it needed to. They guided him toward the patrol car, one of them reciting his rights, but Malcolm wasn't listening. His focus was on the house across the street, the one where an older woman, his longtime neighbor, stood on her porch, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. She had seen him come home, she had seen the cops waiting for him, and when the time came, she would tell them exactly that. It was all part of the plan. The drive to the station was uneventful. The officers spoke, but Malcolm didn't respond. He just sat in silence, his expression calm, his posture relaxed. By the time they pulled into the station's back lot, the shift in atmosphere was palpable. The department was tense, restless, something was coming, and they all knew it. They led him inside past rows of desks where officers glanced up from paperwork, their gazes flickering between Malcolm and the ones escorting him, some confused, some expectant. He was taken to a small, windowless room, the kind that had seen countless interrogations before him. The walls were bare, the table scratched from years of use, a single overhead light flickered slightly, casting sharp shadows. They left him there. Malcolm waited. 15 minutes passed before the door opened again. Captain Holt stepped inside, his presence alone enough to change the air in the room. He was a man who carried authority like a weapon, who never spoke without knowing his words carried weight. He dropped a file onto the table and took a seat across from Malcolm, his fingers tapping once against the surface. "You know why you're here?" Holt asked. Malcolm leaned back slightly, tilting his head. "Not a clue." Holt exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled. He opened the file, flipping through the first few pages before sliding it toward Malcolm. Inside were pictures, images of Miller and Callaway, beaten, bruised, humiliated, one of Miller lying in his own blood, another of Callaway staggering into the precinct, barely able to stand. Malcolm didn't blink. Holt watched him carefully. 2 officers were attacked in the past week, both of them beaten within an inch of their lives, both of them convinced they know exactly who did it. Malcolm raised a brow. "That's so." Holt leaned forward slightly. "You want to tell me where you were last night?" Malcolm smiled. There it was, the question he had been waiting for. He let the silence stretch before answering. "Sure, I was at the Bellagio, casino floor, main bar. You'll find the security footage matches up exactly with the time Miller was getting his ass handed to him." "Funny how that works, huh?" Holt's expression didn't change, but